Out there. I'm Eric Hammond. If you don't know me, I work for Carson University Extension in Adams County. I do horticulture outreach and engagement there. Um, Today, this is a quick little Zoom talk on how to pick trees for Northern Colorado, although it applies to a lot larger area than that, and then how to plant them, mostly focusing on the planting. It's a small group, but I just want to make you all aware of a couple things before we started. There's been some issues with extension talks that have been done over Zoom with security. You've probably read about that sort of stuff in the news or heard about it in the news. Some of it was actually fairly horrific. So in response to that, um, we've tightened the security around these talks a little bit. So that's why there was a waiting room. People won't be able to get into the talk until we admit them. And then we're going to close the talk to new people about 10 minutes in to keep people from kind of coming in at the last second who maybe mean harm. We also have disabled the chat. So that's where you would normally ask questions. We will have opportunities where we open the chat to ask questions, but for now it's just muted. That's why you can't type anything. We've muted that just because that was one of the ways people were trying to disrupt meetings. Strange world we live in. So also, just so you know, we will do our best to get this talk uploaded to YouTube afterwards and post the link to our Facebook page. A lot of these long talks we've done on Fridays have gotten uploaded. However, a couple of them haven't due to technical difficulties with the closed captioning and things like that. So this talk, hopefully we're going to be able to get online pretty quickly afterwards, with maybe by sometime Monday morning. So a few more people trickling in, but I guess we're already over time to start, so I'm going to get started now. I'll try to pause for questions every, 10, 15 minutes. And then at that point, Cassie will open up the chat a little before that to maybe collect questions. So, okay, so preamble aside, let's talk a little about selecting trees for the Front Range and how to plant them. So, all right. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we pick trees, what we're looking for, in a tree in our area, so maybe some criteria we want to think about. One thing that whenever you're working with trees, whenever you're planting them or maintaining them, or even just maintaining the landscape around them, that you want to keep in mind is that trees are complex living organisms. We see their canopy, we see their trunk, we tend to think about those things, but they also have these root systems, which are huge for mature trees. They can be 2 to 5 times the size of the canopy. And when we plant trees, we want to think about the root system. We want to think about where it will be eventually if we care about that. We want to think about, is that area where the root system is being watered? When are we thinking about the soil conditions in that large area and our use? Are we going to put a lot of compaction on the soil in those areas? So anyways, just something to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. When I'm thinking, the big thing, and I've moved this to the top of my talks on picking trees, if I'm planting more than one tree, or even if I'm planting a tree in an established landscape, one thing you want to be thinking about is planting a diversity of species, families, varieties in your landscape. You don't want to just have all your trees be the same species, variety, etc. Even though it's something that oftentimes we want because we like that uniformity as humans, or at least some of us do, diversity is going to serve you a lot better in the long run because it's going to provide you protection against some of the things you see here in the pictures. So like invasive pests like emerald ash borer. If you think about a yard, if that yard has nothing in it but 4 or 5 ash trees, and emerald ash borer shows up, which it did a few years ago, you're pretty upset if you're the landscape owner and all you have is ash. But if you have one ash amongst your 4 or 5 trees, you're not happy about it, but it's not the end of the world for you. So planting a diversity of trees gives you like a bit of an insurance policy against pests. In this picture, this is a elm tree that's been girdled to help prevent the spread of Dutch elm disease. That's wiped out American elm to a large extent as a landscape tree in the 70s and 80s. Thousand canker disease, A black walnut would be another example of this. And then on top of that, we've had weather events recently that have affected certain species of trees and not others. So I think you really want to be thinking about planting um, a good diversity of plants um, in your landscape. Another thing I think you want to think about is water needs. We live in a dry place. Any talk I do on anything for landscape horticulture, I always talk about this because we always need to be thinking about it. This is the current drought map for the state. You can see much of the northern Front Range, at least in the section closer to the foothills, is not under drought right now, but the other more colorful parts of the state are in drought conditions to one degree or another. It doesn't take very long going back in the Wayback Machine. This is 2013, but there's no other droughts between then and now to find times when a lot of the state was under fairly severe drought. So especially with trees, you really want to be thinking about planting trees that can tolerate dry periods because we're going to have them. And a tree is a long-term investment, so it's going to go through them. We want to be thinking about growth rate. Everyone wants a fast-growing tree, but really most fast-growing trees are not all that desirable in the long run. They tend to be weak-wooded, they tend to be messy, they tend to be prone to disease and insect issues, and they tend to be short-lived. So I always try to, tell people that, just because a tree doesn't grow 4 feet a year like a cottonwood, doesn't mean it's not a tree that you should want to plant. When you plant a slower-growing tree, you're planting a tree not only for yourself, but for the future people who are going to use that landscape. When you plant a fast-growing tree like a cottonwood, that's pretty much just for you. Most cottonwoods in a landscape setting going to live 30 to 60 years max, at least the common ones we plant. So it's the tortoise and the hare story, right? The tortoise won that race, and it's the same thing with the slow-growing trees. A big thing along the Front Range, and this applies, in different ways to other regions, is we want to make sure that we pick trees that are tolerant of our soils, whether that's the more common heavy clay soils that we tend to have, alkaline heavy clay soils, in which soil oxygen can be a limiting factor, and some micronutrients can be in non-soluble forms like iron. We want to pick trees that can tolerate that if that's what we have, or if we've got sand, which some areas along the Front Range do have blow sand, you want to pick trees that are able to deal with that. We want to pick trees that'll make it through our winters, but also trees that can withstand the heat of our summers, and trees that can tolerate the rapid temperature changes that it seems like we've always had, but are having more and more of here along the Front Range. Even this last little over a week ago, we had a fairly significant temperature swing around that snow event that may have damaged a lot of pine and spruce along the Front Range. So anyway, so we want to make sure that we're picking trees that tolerate our climate and all of its little intricacies and nuances. And then finally, we want to make sure we're picking the right tree for the place. And we're putting a tree in the right site before we plant it. So, in this case with the power lines overhead, this tree was obviously too big for that site. They should have picked a smaller tree for that site, or maybe no tree at all. Same thing with like proximity to buildings, right? You don't want to be planting a blue spruce 5 feet from your house, because blue spruce get to be 30 feet wide when they're mature. And you go from having a nice little blue spruce next to your house, to having a nice little house inside a blue spruce. So right plant, right place, that's one of the foundations of landscape horticulture, landscape design, and you want to think about it with trees too. So what I'm going to do here very briefly, because I really want to focus on planting on this talk, is I'm going to run through a quick refresher for some of you, or maybe a quick list for others of you of shade trees you might think about planting along the Front Range. And I'm going to be very brief with this. I'm more than happy to chat with you about trees afterwards. I got a lot of emails after my last talk, and I actually think I still have 1 or 2 I haven't responded to, but I'm going to get back to everybody. Now, if you have questions about individual trees, we can do a little of that. So some common trees. Ooh, that picture is a little grainy. Bur oak is a pretty common tree in the trade. You can find it at most nurseries, even some of the big box stores. Bur oak is one of the most reliable shade trees you can plant along the Front Range, and it's truly tolerant, truly adaptable, I should say. It will tolerate wet soils, it'll tolerate dry soils, it'll tolerate clay, it does okay in sand. So it's one that I recommend. It does get to be a pretty large tree. The one on the left is in Ohio. For bur oak to get that large here, we're talking, probably longer than a human lifespan. The tree on the right, the tree on the left is, the tree on the right is in Ohio. The tree on the left of the screen is in Westminster. and that's about an 80-year-old bur oak in Westminster. Used to be growing along where that street was. There was an irrigation ditch. Now it's a yard. The homeowner doesn't even irrigate, so it's tolerated both conditions, you can see. And I've said it a million times, but my silly thing about bur oaks is, they're like that friend that we all have is, no, you're not the most exciting person. You're not going to call them to go out with you on a Friday night or something like that. But, they've got a truck and they're reliable and they'll show up to help you move. Bur oak's that sort of tree. And so it's a good, reliable choice here for the Front Range. And there's a smaller one at our office. You might also think about English oak. English oak is a pretty reliable tree. Maybe not quite as tough as bur oak, but still fairly tolerant of dry conditions and our heat. More formal looking tree. If you like a little more formal, like pyramidal look to your tree. It also does this thing where it oftentimes keeps its leaves brown on its branches through the winter, then they fall off in the spring, which some people like and some people don't. I personally like it. I think it's a nice texture, but some people just don't like it. So maybe more excitingly, though, there are all these selections of oak, which are smaller, more upright trees, which are being introduced now. We've always had this upright English oak on the left, but even in this picture, you can see this big branch looks like it's coming out of the canopy. And that's what would happen to these upright English oaks, is they'd come apart during snowstorms. A lot of the newer selections are actually hybrids. And so this one is one that I really like, Crimson Spire Oak. It's a hybrid between white oak and English oak. And it gets the beautiful red fall color of white oak, but has some of the other more beneficial, more desirable traits of English oak, like it does better in our soils and things like that. It's maybe going to get 15 feet across, 30 feet tall, if that. So it's good for smaller yards, and it's got beautiful red fall color, which is the second thing people always ask for after a fast growing tree, is they'd like a tree with nice fall color, and Crimson Spire Oak has that. Here's one just to show you I practice what I preach in a yard I used to have back in Erie. A super common tree that is probably overplanted, but one you still might consider for really tough sites is honey locust. Nice yellow fall color, otherwise not that ornamental of a tree, very small little leaves, or leaflets rather, that oftentimes will blow away in the wind, so needs less raking. They oftentimes also will accumulate in like low spots on sidewalks rather, and make a slippery spot when they're wet or icy. So that's something to keep in mind. There's the fall color. Here's one growing in this, it's been planted too deep, you can tell because there's no flare, but growing in this unirrigated situation where there used to be a pool and just doing just fine. So they're very tough trees, probably overplanted a little bit though. So I backed off on recommending them so much, but for a tougher site or kind of a medium-sized shade tree, it's still something you might consider. One that's pretty available but not that common that you might think about is horse chestnut. Horse chestnut gets a beautiful white flower late in the spring after the leaves come out. Nice kind of pumpkin orange with maybe a little bit of yellow in it, fall color. So it's got a lot more seasons of interest than some of the trees I talk about. It's kind of close relative of Ohio buckeye you might also consider, but I think horse chestnut's a little more adaptable, so that's why I chose to talk about it here in the talk. This is the fruit of horse chestnut. It can be a little messy. Squirrels love it. They'll chew it up and leave the husks under the tree. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking about horse chestnut. A second ago, I talked about honey locust. One I'm kind of recommending in place of it because it's so common now is Kentucky coffee tree. They are related. Kentucky coffee tree gets a nice yellow fall color. It's kind of a scraggly looking plant when it's young, so a lot of people get turned off by it, but as it ages, it gets kind of a broad canopy with kind of gray exfoliating bark. That's pretty interesting. It does develop the pods you can see in these pictures, which will fall off the tree into the lawn and can be a little bit of a mess, but I don't know, I don't worry about it too much myself. Just trope the pods with the lawnmower and move on with life. So very tough tree, would be good for poor soils, a little lower water situations. There's those pods again. I should also mention there's a podless form called Espresso out there if you want one without the pods. So that is available. Another common tree, which has nice flowers, is Catalpa. Catalpa has flowers near the middle to into June, depending on our weather. Very beautiful when in bloom and can get a decent yellow fall color when the weather's right. It is a tough tree. It tolerates drought. It'll look a little scraggly, but it will come through drought. It does not love drought, but will come through it. You can see a more upright habit too, kind of upright pyramidal habit, much taller than it is wide. So that works well for a lot of the smaller yards that are out there these days. Big old heart-shaped leaves on catalpa, and there's just a little closer picture of the flower. The flower will become a long pod fruit, which some people, again, can find messy, but it depends if you let yourself worry about stuff like that. Real quick, I'm going to go through these very fast. Some trees you might just want to think about that are a little more rare, but might be worth the effort. This is ginkgo. We all know ginkgo from the dietary supplement. It's a pretty interesting tree. It has a fan-shaped leaf. It's actually a conifer, ancient tree genetically. And ginkgo does this cool thing where it drops all its leaves at once in the fall. They turn yellow, hang on the tree for a while, and they all drop over at once, which makes it a little easier from a mowing perspective. If you want to try one, a little protected site is probably good. They tend to struggle getting established, but once they've been in the landscape 5-10 years, then they're usually problem-free. Also, brief note, make sure that if you're buying a ginkgo that you're buying a male, because the fruit that the females develop has a very, very unpleasant odor. So you don't want to be planting females unless you want the fruit for culinary purposes. There's a close-up of the leaves, that fan-shaped leaf, and that's the fall color they get. They're normally green, obviously. A tree I think is going to be really popular along the Front Range that you might want to think about in the future. It'll be popular in the future. They've been working on building up the nursery stock on it. Is chinkapin oak. Chinkapin oak is an oak that they don't grow a lot in the rest of the country because, frankly, they're better oaks for other parts of the country. But for here, where we have real hard time growing trees, it does pretty well, and that makes it a good choice. So it's a little faster growing than some of the oaks, and the leaves will get kind of a burgundy purple color, much like autumn purple ash, which of course we're losing a lot of to emerald ash borer. So tolerates our soils. I think it's a great choice for a shade tree here, one you really might think about if you like that purplish fall color. And becoming more common, I saw them at a number of nurseries last summer for the first time. I haven't talked about lindens in this talk because I've taken them out of this due to Japanese beetle being such a problem with them. But if you want to try a rarer linden, you might try Harvest Gold. It's a hybrid of little leaf linden and Mongolian linden, hardy to zone 2. So if you happen to be a higher elevation gardener and you need a tree for Bloodville or something, you might think about Harvest Gold linden. It does get a beautiful golden fall color and has kind of this interesting bark. I personally like it a little bit more than some of the common lindens, but that's more of an aesthetic. I do think Japanese beetle will be a problem with this plant as well, though, so just keep that in mind. There's the fall color, so you can see a very nice fall color. Okay, so another one that I think will be very popular, become much more popular over time now that it's becoming more common, is this Caddo sugar maple. It gets a beautiful red fall color. It is a selection of sugar maple, from a naturally occurring subpopulation of sugar maples growing in Caddo County, Oklahoma. Many of you are probably familiar with sugar maples as a tree from the Northeast, where the beautiful fall color and all the tourists going to see it up in that part of the country. Those sugar maples tend to be iffy here in Colorado. They don't like our soils. It's too hot in the summer, etc. But this Caddo sugar maple is from Oklahoma, so it's evolved to alkaline soils that they have there, which are very similar to alkaline soils here, and to their hot summers. And so it does a lot better than the normal sugar maple and still gets that beautiful red fall color. I think it's just one of the real winners, one that we are going to be planting a lot more of in the future. And I've found this at numerous nurseries last year along the Front Range. So let your fingers do the walking. If you want one, call your nursery before you go and make sure they have it. There's one someplace I used to live. So beautiful red fall color. I did very briefly want to mention a couple elms you might consider planting. This is the true Chinese elm. It's not Siberian elm, which is the weedy one we all think about. It's also called lacebark elm. This is a planting in Westminster. We've been limited on these because they were borderline cold hardy in our winters, but there have been a bunch of more cold hardy selections made in recent years, which some local nurseries are selling. The real selling point of this tree is it has the vase shape that American elm gets. We've lost American elm mostly to Dutch elm disease. So it has that elm shape, and then it has this really interesting bark, which is why it's called lacebark elm. So, I think it's one that you could consider, especially in a more mature neighborhood where you have like a little more protection from large trees already and things like that. The final one is right now pretty hard to find, the final tree I want to talk about, and that's David elm. This is another elm from Asia, so it has some built-in immunity to Dutch elm disease, which was a disease that came from Asia. It gets a nice yellow fall color, and in a lot of ways looks like American elm. It's got that vase-shaped habit, the dark leaf. It does not have as big a problem with European elm scale, at least to the best of our knowledge, or any of the leaf-feeding insects that bother elms so commonly. So I think it's a real winner. I know there's a selection that was made from trees planted in Fort Collins that is excuse me, that is being worked on right now by J. Frank Schmidt Nurseries out of Oregon. So there may be some more commonly on the market in the future. But if you remember big old American elms and want them again, David elm is the tree you want to look for because it has all those features, but again, resistant Dutch elm disease. So one of my favorite trees. So I'm gonna right now ask Cassie to open up the chat briefly just to collect any questions. So Cassie will give you guys all the ability to chat. And if you have any questions, you can type them in. And I'm going to do a couple trees to avoid, and then I'll come answer your questions. So hopefully Cassie can hear me.
Already done.
Okay, so thank you. So common trees, so there are a few trees that I just don't think we should be planting, or we should be planting very sparingly right now in farm range landscapes. First, some ones to use with caution. The Freeman type maples, like autumn blaze maple, that's probably the one you've heard most commonly. It's probably the most common one, although there are other ones. So people want them because they're fast growing and they have this beautiful red fall color, but they are just prone to chlorosis. So they turn yellow in our soils, and eventually that chlorosis can kill them. It's an iron deficiency, probably also zinc and manganese may be involved as well. So I just don't, unless you know you have a more neutral soil, I would avoid Freeman type maples. There are a lot of them out there and a lot of MEP problems. Also, they generally have a pretty poor structure and are prone to storm damage. I also be very cautious with the true red oak, Quercus rubra, for the same reasons. It can get chlorotic in our soils. Now, again, if you're in an older neighborhood or know you have more neutral soil, you can probably get away with it. I also think we should be very cautious with cottonwoods, but for different reasons. Cottonwoods just are too messy and really too big for most landscape situations. They also want a pretty good amount of water, right? They're not a low water use plant. So they're fast growing, people want to plant them, but they just get too big for most landscape settings. They also have tend to have things like surface roots, which interfere with turf, etc. Right? You can just imagine that this big old cottonwood in this picture is too big for most yards and too messy at the same time. So anyways, I would be careful with cottonwoods. There are also just a couple trees that I would flat out avoid right now along the Front Range. Just I would not plant them pretty much for any reason. And one of those are ash trees. And the main reason for that is, of course, emerald ash borer, which will essentially kill all untreated ash trees north of the Palmer Divide over the course of the next 5 to 15 years. We don't have time in this talk to go into it, but the basics is if you have an ash, you need to make a plan for them, whether you're going to treat or remove them. And if you don't have an ash, I wouldn't plant one. Emerald ash borer is an invasive wood-boring beetle which came over from Asia. And the North American ashes just have no defense against it, and it is devastating on them. It kills literally all untreated trees, so don't be planting ash. The other one, which I don't have a slide on that I would not be planting right at the moment, is black walnut due to thousand canker disease. So I wouldn't be planting black walnuts right now either. Okay, so we're gonna move on and talk about planting, but I was gonna look at the questions here first.
I can read them to you if you want.
Sure, go for it.
Are any of these tree recommendations those that will do well at higher elevations, 7,000 to 8,000 feet?
So the one that's specifically for high elevations that I mentioned is harvest gold linden. So 7,000 to 8,000 feet, you are going to be somewhat limited. And I think you may have asked me questions in previous talks about high elevation plants. If you wouldn't mind either just emailing me or shooting or putting your email in the chat if you're comfortable with that. Probably just emailing me safer. I can go through the list and make sure that I send you that's my email, yeah. Shoot me that question via email and I will do a more thoughtful response because I don't know all the zones off the top of my head and I want to make sure I don't tell you the wrong thing.
Next question is recommendations for fruit trees that do well in the city.
Yeah, so for fruit trees that might, I mean, the most reliable fruit tree that you can plant in our area are apples. A lot of apples will do well here. Honeycrisp, if you like those, do great here. But a ton of apples will do well here. You can also grow pears. You'll probably get fruit maybe 2 to 3 out of every 5 years. If you grow peaches, you're going to get fruit probably 1 in every 5, just due to our frosts in the spring. Plums do much better here. You can grow a lot of varieties of plums, from our native plums to many of the other Asiatic and European ones. So probably the most reliable ones are apples and plums. And then I forgot the tart cherries are the other really reliable ones. If you want cherries, you might think about bush cherries. A couple newer
Except they're
ones.
not importing into Colorado at the moment.
Oh, really? Yeah. So you may not be able to
Yeah.
get those right at the moment. But if last year, actually, local nurseries had some, I bought a few. So you might be able to find them at a local nursery if they were brought in earlier. And they have names like Romeo and Juliet and things like that for the bush cherries. But most of the tart cherries do pretty well here. So.
And last question is, does Kentucky coffee actually produce pods that can be roasted and consumed?
So what my understanding about the Kentucky coffee tree is that as people were moving, as Europeans were moving across North America, they were looking for things that they could make beverages out of, like coffee, and they found they could make a drink out of Kentucky coffee tree that had the color of coffee, but it does not taste anything like coffee. And I think it actually might be like a mildly toxic, like not kill you, but give you stomach troubles or dietary issues. So I'm not 100% on that one, but that's the story behind why it's Kentucky coffee tree. I have a whole book that talks about how to do stuff like that, but I've forgotten the actual issue with it. But I know does not actually taste like coffee; it just has the color of coffee. With that, so I think that's all the questions we had at the moment.
Yep, I think so.
Cool. So Cassie will close chat again. Just again, I think I recognized a lot of the names here were probably fine, but I just want to make sure that we're not Zoom bombed. So she's going to close chat again until the next set of questions. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and spend the last half of the talk talking about how we plant the trees. I always talk about selection first because if you don't pick the right tree, you can't have success no matter how well you plant it. And the opposite is true. You can pick the right tree, and if you don't plant it correctly, you're not going to have success. So some general things that we want to consider when planting. The best time of year to plant a tree in our neck of the woods is early spring when the soil has thawed, but the trees have not yet leafed out. It's just the weather's cooler then. It's a lot lower stress time for the tree to be reestablishing. When you transplant a tree, you're either if it's a balled and burlapped with like a wire basket, you lose a lot of the roots when they dig it out of the field, or if it's grown in a container, it has a very restricted root system to begin with. So the transplant's a stressful time, and doing it when it's cooler is a little easier on the tree. Also worth noting that because of those reduced or restricted root systems, newly planted trees are very prone to water stress. So I'll give you some guidelines on how to water them, but the very short version of it is you're going to be watering them very often with small quantities of water until they become established. I'll talk more about that right at the end of the talk. And then finally, just to note, until they're established, until a tree has reestablished its root system, which can take 1 year per inch of trunk caliper. So the bigger the caliper of the trunk is, the longer it takes to establish, but 1 year per inch of trunk caliper to establish. No tree is drought tolerant. So even if you plant a really drought tolerant tree, you're going to have to provide it water for the first year. Okay. So first thing we gotta do correctly is dig a proper planting hole. And here we have a picture of what a proper planting hole looks like, kind of what a good specification would look like. And I'm gonna break down all the pieces of that here. So the first thing you wanna make sure is that the bottom of the planting hole is firm. The root ball should be sitting on either undug soil, or if you dug the hole too deep and then had to backfill, you should firm the backfill, if you have any, at the bottom of the planting hole. This is just helps reduce the risk of settling over time. You're going to want to dig a hole that has a saucer shape, so slanted walls. Um, it's going to be circular with slanted walls, and then you want the diameter of the planting hole to be 3 times the diameter of the root ball. So if the root ball is 1 inch across, you want a 1 foot across, you want a 3-foot wide planting hole. This just provides a lot of loose soil for the tree to rapidly reestablish its roots in. Lots of times in the industry, they'll do 2 times the diameter. If it's a company that plants, you know, trees commercially just because of time constraints. But really, even larger than three times the diameter of the root ball would be better. The larger, the better. So 3x is kind of the happy median, but larger would be better. We want to so this is a big one here. We want to make sure that we dig the planting hole the correct depth. We want the flare. So the flare is this area here on the trunk to be 1 to 2 inches essentially above grade. So we want to make sure the hole's not too deep. And then we'd like to have a couple big woody structural roots in the top couple inches, the top 1 to 3 inches of the root ball that the tree comes with. That's a little harder to guarantee, but as long as the flare of the tree is going to be, we figure out the depth of our planting hole by figuring out what depth it would have to be to have the flaring of the trunk be a couple inches above grade. So if you have a 12-inch deep root ball, you'd want to dig a 10-inch deep hole, right? You want them to sit a little high. So root ball is 1 to 2 inches above grade, and you want no soil over the top of the root ball. So this depth thing is really important for a number of reasons, but one of them is the prevalence of trunk girdling roots that we see developing on landscape trees. So all those roots that are circling around the edge of a container, they're not going to straighten out. They're going to stay circling. If the tree is deep in the container, what that means is that as the trunk grows out, it grows into its own roots. So by making sure the flare is exposed and above grade, you really reduce the risk of girdling roots developing. And I glossed over something there that's pretty important, and that's that oftentimes in containers, trees are planted too deep in the container. So you can see this tree here was buried 4 to 6 inches too deep in the container. The flare was buried. So you'd want to pull all this soil off the top of the flare and expose it, and then make sure the planting hole was shallow enough that the flare is 1 to 2 inches above grade to prevent, a situation like this occurring, 10, 20 years down the road. For our backfill, we want to make sure that the backfill is not over the top of the root ball, but it kind of covers the curve at the edge of the root ball. And this is the reason for that. If we plant too deep and there's soil over the top of the root ball, often one of the quirks about how water moves in soil is that it doesn't like to move from one texture of soil to another texture of soil. So you might the water moves through the backfill, hits the root ball, and then moves around it because it doesn't want to move across the texture differential between the backfill and the root ball. And then you can end up with water pooling at the base of the planting hole, or the water just drains depending on your soil and doesn't get into the root ball. So you want to make sure the top of the root ball is exposed, and that's where you would apply water. So it's fairly simple, right? So a planting hole that is 3 times the diameter of the root ball, is saucer shaped, and shallow enough that the flare is above grade. Again, you may have to expose the flare, pull off soil from the top of the root ball until you find it before you figure out what the actual height of the root ball is. Pretty straightforward. A few modifications to this that you can make if you're dealing with difficult soils. If you're planting in soil that's consistently wet, you'll plant the tree even higher with a third of its root ball above grade. This is just to provide the roots a little more oxygen. So if you have a really wet spot that you're dealing with, that's how you would do it. If you're dealing with a really heavy clay, or really compacted soil, it's going to really benefit the tree to dig a lot larger planting hole, 4 to 5 times the size of the root ball, like you see in the yellow area there. This is also a good point to note that if you are dealing with a new yard and the whole yard is rototilled beforehand, in some ways the whole yard is kind of your planting hole, right? It's all been loosened. So in that case, you can just dig a hole the size of the root ball and put the tree in, because really the whole yard's the planting hole. So anyway, but if the soils are crummy, bigger planting holes are better. If you're planting on a hill, you want to plant out of the hill, which means either you either dig out and make kind of a berm the tree is planted in, you dig in and you plant the tree in the flat area you create by digging into the hill, or you do some kind of combination where you go a little out, a little in, which is the middle picture, sorry. So either all the way in, half out, or all the way out. So you make when you say out of the hill, what they're meaning is that you flatten, you dig to flatten the hill, to make a flat spot on the hill, rather. And that's where you plant. You do not do something like this, where you plant it where the root ball is, straight up and down into the hill, and part of it's like covered. So I think to think about there. A little tip, you don't actually have to excavate all the soil for that 3x size of the root ball planting hole. You can dig a smaller planting hole, then shave the sides and use those shavings as backfill. So you're still loosening 3x the size of the root ball in soil, but you didn't have to like dig it all out of the hole and put it all back into the hole. So that'll save you a little time. If you're using an auger, this is another method you can use to get that saucer shape, right? You use the auger to dig a cylinder, and then you shave the sides to make it a saucer. So this is probably the most difficult part of planting for people, but it's one that I think is very important. And that's that before we put our well-selected tree in our well-dug planting hole, we're going to want to get rid of any of these circling roots that we may see circling the container or the outside of the burlap or the inside of the burlap. Again, as I said, those circling roots are never going to straighten her. They're wood, right? So they're always going to be curved like that. This can lead to structural issues, the tree not being anchored as well. It can lead to girdling when the tree grows out to those roots, especially if the tree is planted too deep. I just can't tell you the number of trees that I look at in landscapes that are struggling due to circling roots. Eventually, if the tree grows out to those roots, it starts kind of compressing its own vascular system and preventing the proper movement of water and nutrients through that vascular system, which may not kill the tree outright, but it can lead to stress and sometimes can predispose the tree to other conditions, and sometimes it can kill a tree outright. So let's look at just one root system here on a tree. So you can see this tree had obviously been held for a while. It's got large circling roots. You can see roots grow out. They grow out from the tree. They hit the edge of the container, and then they deflect and circle around in a circle. They also deflect and start growing upwards. Another thing that happens is they reach the surface as they grow upwards, as they get air pruned and then start growing across the surface. So actually, not only do we have these circling roots, but then we can kind of get a cage of roots created over time. So here you can see one that was growing straight up. This root here was growing straight up. And then when it got to the surface, you can see there's roots growing across the surface. So the circling roots you see at the edge may not be, all of the problem. Here's an example of one that was growing around the edge, right? One that was growing back across, that deflected off the outside and is now growing back across. This could girdle the trunk even at a pretty young age. So, this is a problem with containerized plants. It can also be a problem with balled and burlap plants, although sometimes not quite as big a problem. And you want to do something about it at planting. And I could do a lot longer talk on the different options you have as to dealing with this. But probably the best one is root shaving. So root shaving is just taking that circular root ball and either using a sawzall or an old pruning saw to shave off all those dysfunctional circling roots. Um, and so you take your circular root ball, and it becomes like a hexagon or something, depending how big it is. The first time you do this, it is stressful. You're like, I just spent all this money on this tree. Am I killing it? But I've planted so many trees now that I've done this too, and I think they do. In fact, not only do they, if you do it properly, do they recover from it? I think they actually bounce back and reestablish quicker than other trees. So the idea is you take off all those circling roots and you kind of give the tree a do-over, right? You kind of press the reset button and hopefully you get more natural outward growing of roots into the backfill. Other methods that are out there include slicing, where you would take the root ball and you would slice it into quadrants, just straight up and down. That may have some benefit, but research has shown that it's not as good as the shaving or boxing that you see here in the picture. This is such a problem, actually, that some people even recommended bare rooting all new trees. So washing off all the soil and then straightening out the root system manually, removing any roots that can't be straightened. I don't know if that's practical in a lot of landscape situations, but that's something that's been suggested. Yeah. So anyways, I think the shaving or boxing is probably the way to go. So once you get your root ball shaved, you'll carefully place the tree in the planting hole, and then you'll backfill. Things to remember about backfilling. One, there's no need to amend the backfill with compost or anything like that. A lot of nurseries sell a lot of compost to mix into backfill, but it's not only does it really not do much good, but in the end, it can actually make things worse. For the tree. It creates kind of like a pot for the tree, so roots want to stay in the planting hole and are less likely to leave and become established in the native soil. Also, if you amend a lot, that amendment is organic matter, right? So it's going to decompose. So over time, the soil in the planting hole will seem like it's decreasing in volume as that amendment breaks down. And really, the recommendation doesn't make any sense, because for most landscape soils, what we want is 5% organic matter. That would be ideal. And so for a planting hole, to get 5% organic matter, that's a couple shovelfuls of compost, not a whole bag. And if you want to do a couple shovelfuls, I think that's fine, but I would not be adding bags of compost to the backfill. You're going to backfill, and then on top of the backfill, you're going to put 3 to 4 inches of organic mulch, which would be like wood chips or straw. Most commonly, we use wood chips. We keep the wood chips back from the trunk. And then there is a recommendation actually out there now to keep the wood chips back off the top of the root ball, to leave the top of the root ball exposed. That was due to some research that was done in Florida about some negative impacts of keeping wood mulch over root balls. I have planted so many trees in Colorado where I've mulched over the root ball, and I have not seen any trend of damage on those trees or anything like that. So I don't know if that's important in Colorado or not. I still tend to mulch over my root balls, but just so you know, there's a recommendation out there not to do it. Yeah. So the mulch should go to the edge of the planting hole, and that just creates an area where the tree doesn't have to compete with weeds or grass. It's just an area of soil that's just for the tree. Tree roots tend to establish much more rapidly under wood mulch because it acts as for a couple of reasons, but one, because it acts as a blanket for the soil. It smooths out the hot peaks during the hot part of the day, kind of keeps the soil cooler during the hot part of the day, and it keeps the soil warmer during the coldest parts of the night. It also helps the soil retain moisture, kind of prevents soil moisture from evaporating from the soil surface, or moisture from evaporating from the soil surface. So there's a little bit of a water conservation thing there as well with that. So you'll have your tree planted, you'll have the mulch out there. The next critical thing after it's planted is post-planting care. And the part about that I'm going to talk about is watering. It is really important to, I guess I'll take the time to explain a little bit about tree roots. So Trees generally have two types of roots. They have fine feeder roots, which are the very small roots that absorb water and nutrients, and then woody fibrous roots, which are mostly for storage, and then anchorage and things like that. A new tree comes with very few fine feeder roots, so they're very prone to drought stress. Those fine feeder roots also, it's important to understand they are short-lived. A tree grows several flushes of them during a growing season, and if one of those flushes is killed, it can really set the tree back, and they are killed by low soil oxygen or drought, low soil water. So missing a watering with a new tree can kill a set of fine feeder roots or partially kill a set of fine feeder roots and really set a tree back. So you have to be really diligent about your watering with young trees. You want to make sure you water them often. For a newly planted tree, that might mean every day, every other day. For a tree that's been in the ground for a month, maybe that means once a week. For a tree that's been in the ground a year, maybe that means once a month. Those are all very rough estimates. You want to water them often with small quantities of water, right? You don't want to overwater them because you're watering all the time. So we recommend 10 gallons of water per inch of trunk caliper per watering. So if you have a 1-inch tree, you'll give it 10 gallons of water, and you'll water, when the top inch or so of the soil in the root ball is dry. That's how you know it's time to water. So for a young tree, that might be pretty often. Again, changes as the tree ages. There's no real need to deep water trees. Tree roots, especially in our heavy clay soils, tend to be in the top 12 inches of soil. So you don't need to buy one of those big 3-foot needles or anything like that. Better to water at the soil surface and let it kind of percolate down into the first, 8 to 12 inches of soil. So remember, we also want to be watering where the roots are. In the first year after planting, most of the tree's roots are still going to be in the tree's root ball. So that's where you want to focus on watering. That's where you set the hose. That's where you empty the watering can. The second year, we assume that some of the tree's roots are now in the planting hole. So we're watering not only the root ball, but the planting hole. And by the third year, we assume if everything went well, that the tree's roots are now out into the native soil. So now we can water more broadly with a sprinkler or something like that, or a drip line that's wrapped around. That's a drip line that's out the edge of the tree's canopy, something like that. If you're going to water with drip, a big mistake I see made is a lot of young trees, they just run a couple of these button drip emitters to the tree. And that may be fine for the first year or two, but as a tree ages and the root system grows, those little emitters aren't really going to do it. So instead, using some of this drip tape, I know this isn't a vegetable bed, but using this drip tape where there are inline emitters every so often, and putting that like under the canopy of the tree, like around the drip line of the tree, the edge of the canopy. It's confusing that both terms are drip line, but you put this drip tape at the drip line of the canopy of the tree. And that way you water a larger, more uniform area. So the other piece, and I didn't think I was going to have time to talk about it, but we have a few minutes for questions, and I'll just put in a little blurb about it, even though I don't have any pictures, is staking. So, you've got your tree, it's in the planting hole, you got the watering right, and now you're wondering, should I stake this newly planted tree? And my answer to that is that for most trees, they probably do not need to be staked. They may need to be staked if they're large, sometimes if they're an evergreen, or they're in a really windy site. Instead, I'd rather see you, properly dig a planting hole. Once you set the tree in the planting hole, you can take some of the soil and right around the base of the root ball, make a little donut of compacted soil, kind of like a little life preserver around the base of the root ball. And that'll help hold it upright. If you need to stake a tree, be sure to stake it loosely so it has some room to blow in the wind and develop its own natural strength. And use canvas straps. That's what we really recommend as extension. So I've done a few minutes early, but actually it's about perfect for questions. So here's some resources you might consider. We have our number up here for the Adams County Master Gardeners. That may not work right now, the number I've given you, due to the fact that the office is closed. But anyways, Plant Select, which promotes plants including trees for our area. The Cohorts blog, where all of us extension agents contribute articles periodically. And then if you do internet search for either tree planting steps for Colorado, tree planting steps Colorado State, or the Front Range Tree List, You can get good resources from CSU if you do those searches. I just checked them. They'll come up with our resources at the top of the list. I also have a handout version of this that if you'd like, you can send me an email and I'll send it to you, the list of trees that you might consider planting. So with that, I will check and see if there are any more questions.
You want me to read those again?
I think I got them. Let's see.
Okay. And I have also started the poll, the end of class poll, if anybody can give us some answers on those as well.
Okay, so there's a couple questions. One is, yeah, and they're moving now because you guys are so kind. Okay, is it not advisable to get water on the trunk of the tree during watering? It's not a big deal to get the trunk of a tree wet during watering. I wouldn't be stressing about it. In other parts of the country where it's more humid, they worry more about like trunk rot and stuff like that. Even there, I don't think they worry too much about getting the trunk wet. I wouldn't want it just being blasted by a sprinkler all the time or something. That might lead to problems. But if you just spray the trunk with a hose or something, that's not a problem. Let's see, there's a question about grafted fruit trees. Oh, yeah, where they put a pear and a peach or multiple apple varieties in the same tree. So my feeling about those, so first of all fruit trees are grafted, almost all of them anyways, where they have a rootstock and then scion wood on top of that. But now there's been this trend towards these like radically grafted trees where there's like 3 or 4 varieties of apple on a tree, or they've grafted cherries and peaches in the same tree, or all sorts of weird things like that. So for those more extreme cases, what generally happens is that the most aggressive grafted variety beats out the other ones. So even if it's all apples, the apple that's grafted, that's the most vigorous, will eventually shade out the other ones. And in the end, you'll have one apple variety anyways, unless you do a lot of pruning to suppress the fast growing varieties. I think they're probably also a little more prone to breakage and things like that. So I'm not a huge fan of them. They're kind of fun to experiment around with, but they do have some drawbacks as well. Let's see. For a tree that tends to have shoots, is it recommended to keep cutting the shoots? Will that eventually stop? Okay, so for a tree that tends to sucker a lot from its base or things like that, you should prune those off and pretty much as quickly as you can. It's not the end of the world if you don't, but it'll help the tree if you do. Once they start suckering, they don't tend to stop. And some trees are just more prone to that. So once they start suckering, they probably are going to keep suckering for life, and you'll just be pruning them off regularly. It's kind of the way it goes. I should mention there is a product called Sucker Stopper that you can buy. That's a plant growth hormone that you can spray on the buds of suckers before they open. And it works pretty well on like the apples and the cherries, but not so well on like cottonwoods. You could try that too. You can find it at most garden centers. And then the best place to find rare species of apple trees. That's a good question. There are a lot of communities that are based around preserving, interesting and rare apple trees. One that off the top of my head that I'm familiar with is the Montezuma Orchard Project. They do a lot of work preserving Western Slope trees that are part of Western Slope orchards. So I think if you just do Montezuma Orchard Restoration Project or Orchard Preservation Project, I believe you'll come up with that one. Along the Front Range, I'm not sure, of any groups. I would really look on the internet. Look for rare apple groups. I know there are a lot of groups out there that would love to have more members that let you, in, and a lot of them do distributions of scion wood or even grafted trees. That'd be my go to. But the Montezuma Orchard Preservation Project, I think it's Orchard Preservation Project, yeah. Are espalier fruit trees new? No, people have been espaliering trees for a long time. Very, very long time. Espalier, for those who don't know, is a very specialty form of pruning where the tree is pruned out so it only has branches in two directions. Very high intensive. There's the Monster Orchard project. Cassie just posted it. But yeah, espalier pruning is a very high maintenance form of pruning, and it's been done for I would imagine at least hundreds of years in Europe, if not longer. But
The
maybe
Romans did it.
what was that?
The Romans
Romans?
did it.
Yeah, so long time. But yeah, it's kind of cool. Keeps your tree a little smaller, little neat look to it. So I think that was all the questions. If you come with anything else, feel free to email me. Again, I know I still owe a couple emails from previous talks. I had like 25 emails after the pruning talk. It took me a long time to get through them. So thank you all very much. We'll be doing these talks on Fridays. We're going to try to get the recording and putting them up so people can watch them asynchronously down a little better. We're all still learning. So hope you all have a great day and a good weekend.